Hey, what's up, witches? Do not adjust your screens. Yes, my black hair is gone. Can I really still call myself cute girly goth? I don't know, but we're gonna stick with it, and I hope that you will stick with me in this video because the reason I'm filming in front of my little Freya altar here is that in today's video I want to talk to you guys about altars and shrines and what is the difference, because when I first started along this whole path, I just kind of automatically threw up this altar to Freya right off the bat. First thing I did was go order the statue of her and was like, well, I'm working with Freya now, and I'm a Freya follower, and kind of proceeded from there. And now I have what I would call several little altar spaces stashed throughout my home. What started as one has now grown to at least, 3 or 4 at this point, maybe more. I'll show them to you here in this video, so we'll see how many I have at this point. But the reason for this video, as I said, is because I wasn't even really aware until recently in some of my readings and researchings that some do delineate a difference between an altar versus a shrine. And so I kind of just wanted to explore that here with you guys and talk about what some of the definitions and differences between the two are that I have come across, and just kind of discuss it with you and give you the examples of mine and talk about them. So let me find somewhere else to put the camera down. So I'm just holding my little tripod here, and we'll get into it. You might see me looking down a lot in this one because I'm a little notebook full of notes here. So when I was reading that book, The Green Witch, which I talked about for the book club and here on my channel a few months back, one of the things that I noticed in that book was that they delineate a difference between an altar versus a shrine. And that was kind of an entirely new concept to me. I mean, I'm familiar with the concept of shrines in other cultures and religions and the concept in general, but applying the difference to a pagan practice hadn't really occurred to me. I guess just because coming from, mostly like a Wiccan-based magical background, everything is just kind of referred to, in my experience, as an altar. So what I thought I would do first is just go over what the Green Witch defines as the difference between an altar versus a shrine. So in that book, they state that the altar is a dedicated space for performing magical workings, holding magical tools, and it can be, a permanent one or just one that you set up temporarily for a specific magical working and then take down. Or I've seen a lot of pagans who will set up and decorate their altars for the cycles of the seasons and the different Sabbats and equinoxes and things like that. And so the altar is a place of focus consecrated to the spiritual use of the witch, whereas they say that the shrine is used to honor deities or elements, or in our case it could be ancestors or land spirits, and is used primarily as an offering space and is usually permanent, but it's not so much used as the way like a Wiccan or a witch would think of as an altar, as being a space for performing spells and magical crafts of that type. And as someone who's coming into the whole Norse paganism thing, who was previously interested in Wicca and still is interested in the whole witchcraft and magic and spellwork side of things, along with just the paganism and the deity worship side, that kind of just got me thinking about my own practice and how I use what I would consider my altars, and is there a difference? Because I do refer to my spaces set aside for my main deities, like my Freya and Freyr altar that you saw in the other room, and then my Odin and Loki altar are my main 2 altars, as I would call them. And I've just kind of been calling them that by default. And I don't know if that's, as I said, because I'm coming to it from that background where everything is just kind of described as an altar, whereas there are things that maybe on second glance would maybe be considered more as just shrines. So I just kind of wanted to talk about that whole concept with you guys and just go over what I personally consider my spaces as and why. The concept of having a shrine isn't that much different, and it is something that does still exist today. You will see the Shinto shrines over in East Asia and Japan, which are set up for the kami, which are basically like what we would think of as the land spirits, land vatir, land whites, and just that whole animism way of viewing the world where places, animals, trees, everything can have its own spirit, and or at least its own energy to it. And all of that energy is connected in the web of weird. So we do have modern versions of that today. You'll see little roadside little shrines set up as little kind of houses for spirits to live in, and then you will see the temples or the Shinto shrines where people will go and leave offerings of money or incense and make. And then in Hinduism today we also see what I would consider an altar, where it's like you have an image or an icon of your deity, and you go there and you give daily offerings of incense, flowers, they'll dress up the statues and anoint them. So it does still exist today, and it got me thinking about this concept from when I was taking Latin in high school and studying Roman history and culture. It was referred to as the if I can pronounce it correctly, the Lares and the Penates. And this is an interesting concept that I think you might see a little bit of resemblance in modern paganism today. Even when we see in like Tacitus's Germania, where he talks about how the Germanic tribes didn't really have set temples like the way that a Roman would think of as a temple, like a big fancy building made of stone, or like we would think of like a modern day church. They did have, their sacred groves, and he said that for the most part they didn't really seem to have like idols or images carved of their deities, but does mention, things like there being a Nerthus statue that would be taken out and worshipped and things like that. So those types of things and images and idols of deities did exist back then. We just aren't really certain how common they might have been on like a household level, because when I was reading in books like Essential Asatru or Teutonic Myth and Teutonic Religion, it talks about the whole Germanic culture and worldview as a whole, and how each household, like you didn't really have set clergy like you do in the Christian church, where there was a permanent person where that was their only job, was to be the priest. They might have had something like the Druids, which would have functioned more like a councilman. And then they also, in like the Icelandic, had the Gothi, which Diana Paxton was explaining in Essential Asatru was less like a minister and more just like, the spokesperson, the council member for the group or for the tribe that would go speak for them in the assemblies and things like that, and also perform the rites at those certain times of year as needed, but it wasn't like a permanent job status. And so it makes me think of like, well, would a day-to-day pagan back in those times have had an altar to Odin himself or to Freyr and Freya? Because with the Romans, they had the Lares and the Penates were more like localized, And it made me think of how, like, with the Germanic family, you know, like the mother and father would have been like the priest and priestess in a way, because they would just be the ones handing down the culture and the beliefs and traditions to their children and their family, and maybe performing little rites and offerings here and there to gods and spirits as needed. And with the Lares and the Penates, it's interesting because the Lares in the Roman household would have been familial household spirits. They were spirits of the dead, spirits of the family's actual ancestors who had basically become divine. And much like you will see in some like Eastern traditions of ancestor veneration being really big, and just other religious traditions like with the Dia de los Muertos, these ancestral spirits would often stick around to act as guardian spirits for the family. They guarded the homes, and then I think would also kind of be expanded to almost like the land wights, where they were protective spirits of the land itself and of that place. So you might see a Lares who was a guardian of the home, of a crossroads, or of like a city itself. And eventually, I think under like the Roman Empire, it expanded into the, you know, they had like the really fancy highfalutin Lares who were like the protectors of Rome itself and things like that. But every family had their own guardian spirit who was called the Lar Familiaris, the Lares of the family. And their job was to protect the household and the family members and ensure the continuation of the family line. And so every family and every household would have their own little shrine, or what I would call an altar, to these Lares. And every day, or, you know, as needed for special things or manifestings, they would make prayers and offerings at the shrine. From my researching on the interwebs, things like, you know, just encyclopedia.com and whatnot, they would say that historically the Lares might have been represented as little statues that would resemble a youth in a short tunic, so someone who had not yet come of age to wear the long tunic of a citizen of the empire, and they would be holding in their one hand a drinking horn and in the other hand a cup. And that there would have been two of these statues, mirror images, almost like twins, like golden twins, if you will. And there would be one on each side of a central figure who might be Hestia or Vesta, who was the goddess of the hearth and of the home, or just maybe another patron deity. And so in Roman times, yeah, each household would have had their own little family shrine, such as you might even see nowadays in a Buddhist, Shinto, or Hindu household. They will still have a household or family shrine to household or patron deities, ancestors, etc. These Lares would be prayed to help preserve the family line by presiding over and aiding in important family milestones and life changes, such as births, deaths, marriages, coming of age ceremonies, helping with illness and things like that. And then you have the Penates, which are also little household spirits, and they were originally gods of the pantry, like Penates pantry, but kind of expanded in their role to watch over the house itself and everyone in it. So they were also very closely associated with Hestia or Vesta as the goddess of the hearth and the home, and that's also where the Vestal virgins come from. And they ensured the family's welfare, wellness, and prosperity by basically making sure that the pantry stayed well stocked and just providing more material comforts for the family's health, happiness, and well-being overall. So not only did this really give me like some Vanir vibes, just in terms of like in my video explaining the difference between Aesir and Vanir from my perspective, I feel like the Vanir are the gods just kind of more closely tied to the world of Midgard itself, and not only that, but to kind of ensuring our comfort and well-being here on Midgard with those types of things. So the Penates also really reminded me of, in the book, like The Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, where they talked about the brownie being like a little household spirit, or husvatir, as we might call it in the Northern or Norse tradition, where you would have a spirit of the house itself who would just kind of have a little symbiotic relationship with you and with the family, to just help you maintain the household and help with just keeping everyone running and making sure that we have enough food and that we're just well taken care of, so that we can kind of live in relative comfort. And so I think that's a really interesting concept, and it might speak to an older pre-Christian tradition that you might have seen throughout the other places that were under the Roman Empire, such as Germania, Gaul, Britain, and things like that. Because while we don't really know for certain what the people of like the Viking and the pre-Viking age might have done in terms of their day-to-day worship, they might have only gathered during the high holy days and had a gathi or priest presiding over these larger rites, but what about in their day-to-day living? So I feel like with these concepts, such as like the Lares and the Penates, it's not really that far off to imagine that a Germanic or Northern household might have had their little household shrine to their version of Lares and Penates, ancestral spirits, family line spirits, local land spirits that would just be more active and interested in the day-to-day goings-on of that area and of that family, because they live there too. We do know from things like Tacitus's Germania that there were some Germanic tribes that were known to carry smaller totems with them. Like there was one tribe who would carry a totem of a boar into battle with them. So they might have had things to represent totem animals, fylgias, or little totems for patron deities like that. Like a warrior who would carry a totem of Odin or Tyr into battle with him, or a farmer might in his house have a little shrine to Freyr or the land spirits to help fertilize the crops and the cattle that year. So while it might come from more of a modern neo-pagan or Wiccan tradition, for me as a modern Norse pagan to have what I would call an altar to a deity, perhaps it's not that much of a stretch to think that back in the day they might have had something similar. Would it have been to Odin and Loki? Maybe not. Definitely probably not Loki. We don't really know of anything in which he was worshipped back in the day. But in terms of having what I would call an altar, they might have had something like this. So that kind of brings me back to my other point of contention of, is it an altar or a shrine? For me, I feel like mine are a little bit of both, especially my main two. Like this one, I put it on this big table down here. Like I have to kneel on the floor to sit at it, and I wanted something that was like a bigger space so that it could also act as a working space and that I could perform specific workings, spells, offerings, and manifestations to and with Odin and Loki here, as well as other gods maybe as needed. Same with like my Freya and Freyr altars. I don't really do a whole lot actively at them, maybe just because of how they're set up back there. But yeah, some I do kind of use more actively for performing invokings and for a specific purpose. But in terms of my working altar, this is what I would, I guess, consider my altar in the traditional witchcraft sense, by which the Green Witch was. Man, how many times am I going to say witch in the same sentence? This is what I would consider my working altar as defined by the Green Witch, in terms of it is a permanent working space where I actually sit down to perform all my spells. You know, it's also where I film, and so I have like all my little witchy tools and tricks of the trade here, and it's a desk so I can sit down and perform larger spells and larger workings here and have plenty of space for it. Then we have things like this, which I would define more of a shrine. And this is also for Freya, but it's just kind of a little alcove out of the way where I don't really make any active offerings, prayers, or petitions. It's just more of a space to collect different items and things that remind me of her, and just little things that I have accumulated and hoarded. You know, there's a spell, a Freya spell that was given to me, and then like a personal power love spell that I made for myself, a little rabbit totem stone, and then this is just like a little collection of stones and things that remind me of Freya. And so I guess that's what I would consider more of just a little shrine. I think what puts me off of the term shrine is that I don't really like to consider working with the deities as just outright worship in a more modern Christian sense, where it's just like almost a slavish devotion to deity, and, you know, just throwing yourself before them and being like, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy. It's not really like that, which I guess is why I define my main spaces as more altars as opposed to shrines, because I feel like it's more of an active, reciprocal, working relationship than one of just one-sided worship and devotion, if that makes sense. So here's another little area that I would consider to be more of a shrine. This one is for Nehelenia, which is a rather obscure goddess, mostly only attested in like random Roman writings here and there from what I can find. But her shrines were mostly found in like northern Germania and places along the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. And we can see from a few inscriptions we have found and little roadside shrines found dedicated to Nehelenia that she was often worshipped by sailors for safe travel and safe return trips home when they would set out to sea, and if they returned home or returned with prosperity and had a good sailing and a good fruitful journey, they would have made offerings to her upon their safe return. And so she's just someone who's always fascinated me as a obscure northern goddess. So I had kind of made a little deal in my mind when we went on our Oregon trip to meet Njord on the coast last fall, that if we had a safe trip out there and back, I would make this little statue, which I made myself from just some air dry clay, and then painted it as just kind of the traditional depictions of her that you would find in these old roadside shrines. And then added just a collection of different sea-themed objects that I've collected in my travels. Lots of just polished stones that I've collected from the beach. Some fossil stones we collected from the beach on our trip. This was a gift. This abalone shell was a gift. This shell was a gift from people at gatherings. So yeah, I just have like some little jewelry here. And she's not really someone I work with frequently or really have done anything with since then. She's just someone that appealed to me and I felt drawn toward and wanted to have a little space to her in exchange for the blessing that she gave me on my trip. I don't really plan on doing much with her or with this area in the future. I just like having this cool little collection of stuff next to the statue of her, so it kind of turned into a little impromptu shrine, which is kind of way out of left field here. Now we're getting real eclectic up in here. This is what I would consider a little shrine to Ganesha. And Ganesha is a Hindu deity, not one that I ever expected to find myself connecting with. Even back when I was studying Hinduism, I kind of picked up a minor in East Asian studies when I was in school just because I wanted to take all of the classes and learn all of the things about these cultures and traditions. At that time, I found a lot in the Hindu tradition and just pantheism overall that appealed to me, but he would not have been one of the gods that kind of stuck out most in my mind at that time, so it was really interesting and odd to me that over the past year or so, I had kind of just felt once or twice an image or energy of Ganesha coming through. In Hindu tradition, he is called the remover of obstacles, and he is actually a son of Shiva, the god of chaos and destruction. So maybe it comes from me being a chaos kid and working with Loki, and maybe him just kind of, representing that duality as Odin and Loki do of maintaining order versus chaos and things like that. But yeah, I had just kind of felt him reaching out to me, actually, when I was petitioning Odin and other gods for just help with, overcoming some obstacles in my own life. And even though I don't really plan to do a lot with him, don't know if he'll ever come back around again or if I'll connect with him anymore in the future, but I felt his energy coming through so strongly at that time when he did that I wanted to explore it and just wanted to set up a little area for him in my home. And so that's what this is. It's just a little hanging shelf on the wall. This one eventually might be a little ancestor altar in the making, so it's kind of a little prototype right now. But yeah, it's not really anything I plan to actively work at or spend any time with or make daily or regular offerings at even. Put another little abalone shell here with some dried flowers because people will often give flowers and marigolds to Hindu deities and to Ganesha. So yeah, this is one that I would consider to be more of a shrine. It's just a collection of items, significant sacred items, magical items that I don't really do anything active with, but I felt like he deserved a little place in our home. I had him kind of behind my front door in a little nook on the built-ins up there at first, but he seemed a little lonely right there, and I wasn't really sure how. I felt like it was okay having him there facing the Odin-Loki altar in the corner, but I don't know. I wanted him to have his own little space and kind of be here in the living room where we're hanging out a lot, because that's also where I have the Freyr altar. It just makes them feel more actively a part of the household, I think. So there we go. I just wanted to give you a brief little tour of some of the other special little areas that I have since set up in my house that I would not really consider altars in the traditional witchcraft sense, because I don't do any workings or spells or keep any magical tools at them, like the Green Witch says. But at the same time, would I call this an altar or a shrine? It's probably a little bit of both. I do more active things here with Freyr and Freya and try to keep up regularly on the offerings and just kind of keep the line of communication open, not necessarily offering in the expectation of anything in return, just maintaining that relationship, maintaining that connection, letting them know that I'm still love and appreciate them, I guess. but yeah, I guess it would be more of what you might consider a shrine instead of an altar, because I don't do anything here regularly, probably not even as often as I should lately, to be honest, considering I like to consider Freya my patroness. But yeah, it is just kind of an out-of-the-way, pretty decorated shelf where I keep ritual items and objects sacred to Freya and to Freyr, and the same with, the Odin and Loki altar. I used to joke, at first, that before I set up the Freya altar here, it was just kind of a Kirby shrine to my dear deceased and departed cat Kirby. So I was kind of thinking of that as a shrine, because it was just, an area where I had his little box of ashes and the photo to him along with some other things, but yeah, now it kind of doubles as a Kirby and Vanir shrine. So yeah, I guess in terms of my own personal practice and personal definitions, I would consider this one more of an altar, but I guess maybe at the end of the day they are all just shrines, because I don't really do a lot of active spell work at them. If I'm doing that, I'm usually sitting down at the desk in the other room in there. So yeah, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't think the definitions really matter. It's just kind of boils down to semantics and whether you're coming into things from more of a traditional witchcraft perspective, and whether you're interested into that whole side of this or not. So honestly, it's just kind of personal preference. Maybe you aren't really interested in spell work or witchcraft or that aspect of things, and you might call these your deity shrines. Whereas if you're like me and maybe you are going to sit down and kind of petition Odin to come in and do some workings and some spells with you, maybe you would think of it as more of an altar in that case. But I think I'm just going to leave this one there. I hope that you enjoyed exploring these ideas and these concepts with me, because I've been really wanting to talk about things like the Lares and the Penates for a while, so I figured this would be a good way to kind of expound upon that type of information and incorporate it into this larger discussion of modern day practice of paganism as a whole. That's it, guys, and until next time, stay classy, pagans.